Well, parliamentarians, bishops, distinguished guests, fellow honorees, friends, my wife Sue and I are very grateful to join you here today, and very grateful indeed for this award. I accept it on behalf of the burgeoning movement to fight climate change, and in particular, my colleagues at 350.org, a handful of staff and tens of thousands of volunteers working in 188 countries to try and limit the damage to our home planet from global warming. I am so thankful not only to the good folks at the RLA, but also to my fellow honorees for all that their work has meant for the progress of human rights and human potential. As an American, let me give a special note of gratitude to Mr. Snowden, whose remarkable bravery helped all of us understand the dark forces at work in my nation. As we meet here today, the world is almost done with what will be the hottest calendar year in all the years that we have measured temperatures. 2014 saw the warmest temperatures by far ever recorded in the Northern Pacific. It was also the year when we learned, tragically, that the melt of the West Antarctic ice sheet is now irreversible. 25 years ago, when I wrote the first book-length account of this crisis, none of these wounds could have been predicted, but that's because scientists are conservative. The damage has outpaced their forecasts. Every ocean, including the one outside these doors, is now 30% more acidic than a generation ago. Every continent now sees drought and flood on an unprecedented scale. Every scientific body now urges upon us with ever more desperate rhetoric the need for action. You'll find in your packet as one concise reminder of the relevant points a recent publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science outlining once more the grim and by now very plain facts of climate change. And yet, so little action has come. The world will meet again a year from today in Paris to try and reach a treaty, a replay of the meeting that 5 years ago ended in fiasco in Copenhagen. So far, the fossil fuel industry has been powerful enough to block substantial action in most nations, especially the United States, historically the biggest source of carbon now overheating the Earth. We in the climate movement have long since concluded that the fountain of fossil fuel money, which buys politicians and spreads disinformation, can only be met if we coin our own currency, in this case, the currency of movements, passion, spirit, creativity. Sometimes we need to spend the currency of our own bodies and head to jail. And so here is the good news to temper that bleak weather forecast. All over the world, that movement is finally rising. In late September, 400,000 people filled the streets of New York to demand that the UN take action on climate. That was the largest demonstration about anything in the US for some years and the largest demonstration about climate change in history. Those people were joined that day by protesters in 2,600 other cities around the world. The world's first truly global problem is seeing the world's first truly global movement, and it is beginning to have an effect. The same night of that march in New York, the heirs to the Rockefeller fortune announced that they were divesting their holdings in fossil fuel company. The first family of fossil fuel was selling its oil stock. In so doing, they joined institutions from Stanford University to the Church of Sweden, and hopefully soon the city of Stockholm and many others in this green-minded country. Just as 30 years ago, when the question was apartheid in South Africa, the world's people are coming together to withdraw their money from the companies that simply refuse to change their practices. Those companies, Exxon, Shell, Chevron, Gazprom, China Coal, BP, all the rest, have in their combined reserves 5 times more carbon than the world's scientists say we can safely burn. And yet those companies have told their shareholders and their banks that they will dig up that coal and oil and gas and burn it. If they carry out those business plans, then there is no mystery about how this story ends. The planet will simply break. And so we must fight, peacefully but firmly. We must build green cities. And like so many others, I've gotten to visit Stockholm's green neighborhood, Hammarby Sjöstad. It's a model of what the future could look like, as congenial as it is ecological. But beautiful as that vision is, we can't be taking one step forward and another back. This is the point at which I become the impolite dinner guest who criticizes the host. In this city, for instance, planning continues on a massive highway. Ask yourself whether in a decade or two that is the legacy this planet needs, or whether a sharp and dramatic move toward public transit and car sharing might not be better. My fellow honorees last night had the rare privilege of getting to walk aboard the good ship Vasa, and it occurred to me that perhaps projects like that highway may represent the sort of grand and expensive ventures, perhaps not perfectly suited for the world in which they must sail. And ask yourself sharp questions about trying to make every possible penny off the current situation. If Vattenfall, for instance, simply sells its stake in German lignite mines, there's no question that the coal will eventually be dug up and burned. Is not the really responsible course for a nation that grew wealthy in part by burning fossil fuel to make the small economic sacrifice and keep that coal forever underground where it can do no harm? Is that any different than what, for instance, we've asked of the Brazilians when it comes to the Amazon, that they keep it standing? And we very badly need Sweden's cities and governments to follow the lead of the Church of Sweden and divest those fossil fuel holdings. We simply must defeat those forces that want to delay large-scale change so they can have a decade or two more of profit. There's no ducking that fight. If you invest in fossil fuel companies, you profit from the destruction of the earth. That's the definition of dirty money. Those who invest in fossil fuel companies are making a wager that the world will do nothing to combat climate change. That's an immoral wager. And it's an unwise wager as well, because civil society really is rising up. I am reminded of the iconic scene earlier this autumn when our 350.org colleagues in 12 Pacific Island nations that will be underwater on the current trajectory by the end of this century, they took their traditional canoes and transported them to the largest coal port in the world, Newcastle in Australia, and for a day used those tiny canoes to block some of the largest ships in the world to keep them in port. Their slogan, a good slogan for the whole world, would be, "We're not drowning, we're fighting." I'm reminded of the scenes in North America earlier this year where cattle ranchers and Native Americans formed what they called the Cowboy Indian Alliance, a CIA slightly different than the one Mr. Snowden used to work for, to block the Keystone Pipeline and its cargo of filthy oil from the tar sands of Canada. We stand in solidarity with Andean activists losing the glaciers that supply their drinking water, and with Bangladeshi activists watching the seas rise in the Bay of Bengal. We learn from African leaders like Desmond Tutu, who recently called climate change the greatest human rights challenge of our time, and from Sami leaders from the top of the world who are watching berserk winter weather wreck time-honored ways of life. We struggle alongside residents of Delhi and Beijing and the other smog-choked metropolises of our planet, for we know that their children die from the same fossil fuel combustion that endangers the whole Earth. We look with great inspiration to the countries like Germany that are demonstrating daily that it is entirely possible to turn to renewable energy for the power that we need on this planet. Global warming is a test for all of us, the test in our time on Earth. It's a test, in a sense, of whether the big brain was a good adaptation after all. Clearly, that brain can get us in a good deal of trouble, but maybe, just maybe, it is attached to a big enough heart to get us out of some of that trouble. I cannot promise you that we will win this struggle. We have waited a very long time to get started, and the science is quite dark, but I can promise you that in every corner of the world we will fight and fight hard. Thank you so much for helping spread word of that struggle with this great honor.